Danes were near. Small bands of them were still raiding across Watling Street, although they seemed to have focused their attentions to the stretch of the border between Hunstanton and Lundin. It might have been a ruse, she suggested to Mir Al, beside whom she commanded in her first assignation, as they stood in the dark of the night, watching for incursions. Or other factions, he suggested, and they played the game of most as they waited in the darkness, about their now long departed Lord Offa, and their shared experiences in Devonshire, most ugly ... most cowardly ... most stupid, and so on, as they raked the night for flickers of life. It was after one such night on a return patrol that they arrived at the gates of Aylesbury's Hall to find the rear of a train of carts that were heading into the city. "The king," declared a priest, when Mir Al asked. "Of Wessex," the man added when he spotted the colours of Mercia, green and gold, in Mir Al's clothing, and Osrith felt a little embarrassed at herself when she recognised him, as he returned to King Alfred's retinue. They watched as the king got down from of the carriages, refusing to be helped by anyone, and keeping a stiff, upright form. But it was that stiffness which betrayed him, that Alfred was indeed very ill. Yet, he had seen fit to travel all this way to speak to, presumably, the Lord Ethelred. But it was the person who came next out of the carriage which would occupy Osrith's thoughts as she was given leave, went with Mir Al to the Bull Inn, near the eastern part of Aylesbury, and enjoyed a jar of milk as Mir Al relaxed in the company of two other commanders also given leave. "We met at Lundin," came the same voice who had spoken to them that day, and Osrith turned her head full of distracted thoughts to look at the priest. It was Father Pyleig, and Osrith realized at once where she had seen him before. Besides being Alfred's priest, Osrith had watched him fight for his freedom, under terms agreed by Eric and Siegfried. In fact, it was that fight that had given her inspiration at Dunham. "I think you fought bravely, Father," Osrith said, when she had told him she remembered the day. But it became clear that Pyleig had not come for small talk. "The Atheling, Edward, asked me to find you," Pyleig went on, "and make you aware he is in Aylesbury. Though what for, I cannot imagine," he added, looking at her disapprovingly. "There is only one way to find out," Osrith replied, with stiff politeness. "If you will excuse me," she added, this time to Mir Al, and he nodded as she got up. To her disappointment Pyleig followed her. "I should add, he is married," Pyleig said. Osrith stopped, and turned to face him. If Siegfried's best warrior could not defeat him, then perhaps Osrith the Mercen would try. "What is it that you suppose of me, Father Pyleig?" Osrith asked, her guilt at his probable correct assumptions swamped by overweening self-righteousness. "Is it because I am a female?" "No," Pyleig replied, placing a hand firmly on her forearm, and looking at her intently. "Because he is a male." Osrith nodded slowly. He was being cautious for her, which was touching. "Do you know why he wants to speak to me?" "I do not." And, as she turned to go to find the Lord Edward, Osrith noticed, with disappointed resignation that, despite what he could have done, Eutod of Bibbenburg had not stayed with his brother, but brought his men, Skade and the Lady Ethelfled to Aylesbury. 88,888,888. "It is good to see you." Edward was in a script room at the far end of the palace at Aylesbury when Osrith found him. He was looking at some manuscripts, his hair neatly styled as his eyes strayed over illuminated letter after illuminated letter. Osrith said nothing for some time, her eye half hypnotized by a guttering candle near one of the windows, and so lost in thought she became that it took the Etheling's low, clear sounding of her name for Osrith to look at him. "You sent for me, Lord Prince?" Edward nodded his head once, and stepped towards her. "A Danish army is heading our way, did you know?" He circled back to the table, which held, Osrith could see, a map of Brittany, of the country. At the top, in a wide section, which almost looked like a peninsula, was Alba, and she scanned down it at the heptarchy marked out. A landmass, almost rectangular in size but with scant markings, was labelled, Ireland. "I cannot take on an army of this magnitude by myself," Edward told her, plainly. "I have asked for Pyleig to wait outside, for I do not wish anyone, least not the king, to know I am speaking to you. You are not of the Viton, but, and here it was when the prince made the corner of Osrith's heart disintegrate, and with it, the rest of her senses. It is your opinion I value the most, Osrith. For you can see things I cannot. Tell me, he continued, placing a hand on Osrith's shoulder, his face agonizingly earnest, what chance would I, alone, have, of defeating this army in its entirety? Osrith looked from Edward's hand, along his arm and up to his face. Though he was a man, a young man, there was still a certain vulnerability about his character that made Osrith turn to him. Do you believe that dividing the army in some way would make a difference? And Edward's face regained a little more of his composure, for he knew then that his old guard and lover understood exactly his concern. I believe it could slow them down, far better than one big battle. Osrith, I cannot manage a great army, command our allies, not yet. I do not have the strength, or the influence over men my father counts on. Sigebrev Kent, Osrith thought. You took Ecgwin from him, married her, fathered twins. Only now you realize the value of playing the long game, where an alliance might make all the difference, and the rest is just base entertainment. Was your father ready? Osrith asked him, concern showing on her face. No, he just had to act and do what he could. He had little time to think. She crossed to the map, looking at the markings upon it, new marks, perhaps troop maps, in the western section of East Anglia, where little bands of Angles willing to fight with Mercia against the Danes were depicted, where Cent was added, with a big arrow from the bottom right. Where Mercia and some allies in the border regions of Cymru would add to the fight. But Edward did not have one clear consistent voice as Alfred did, Ethan done, though mightily knife-edge, had given one thing to Edward's father that Edward could not attain, unity based on a common cause. Yes, there were Danes. There always were. But what the Etheling didn't see was what it was that tied all of these disparate peoples together, that he could use to wield them. Osrith couldn't tell the Etheling what it was, either. He had to discover it for himself. This is a long-term strategy, Osrith said, looking back to him. And sometimes unsavory things have to be done, quick decisions made, and that is the other part of you. You have the grace and ability to make people listen to you. It was Osrith's turn to approach Edward now, and touch him on the arm. You should do what you believe is right, if in your heart you feel it is the right thing to do. I feel this is the right thing to do, Edward said, and pulled Osrith to him, kissing her deeply, longingly, needfully. Pylig was right, Osrith knew, when the Etheling tried to reach for her body, and she pulled away, firmly, fervently hoping that he had listened to her words. She broke off, and stepped from Edward. No. She scolded him, silently. Listen to my words, they are more valuable than your libido. Yet, Osrith knew it was not just the physical act that Edward felt, there was a closeness between them, he trusted her, to a point. He had just asked her for her advice and for someone else to find her. There was a genuineness to the Etheling, and that made the difference. Find a way, Osrith urged. Your way, that unites every one of your factions against them. She trailed her hands over his shoulders and down his arms, finishing by taking his hands. Go to Bicca, to Pylig, ask them for help. They are neutral. And then Osrith kissed Edward this time and told him it was good to see him too, before he strode out of the room, and down the corridor to Mercia's throne room. 88,888,888. Ale or milk? Osrith stood in the front of the bear-inn this time, and watched as Osferth moved shamefaced away from the table at which were assembled Utard, Finan and Sihtric and Edward and Ethelfled. The earnest-faced man looked up to her and on recognizing her, shook his head. It was no wonder Ethelwold wanted to drink those days back in Winchester as decisions passed him by, and she smiled encouragingly at Osferth. It could be worse, she nodded towards them. It could be worse. My mother could have been married to Alfred rather than be his maidservant. Osrith nodded again and placed a hand on Osferth's arm. I wish I understood. I think it must be difficult. Difficult? Osferth said, with a sudden brightness. No. No expectations have ever been placed on me, except by the Lord Utard. Nobody ever needed me to be educated, or expected me to be scintillating company or offer brilliant insights. He nodded towards Edward. My half-brother, it is he who I pity. Imagine having Ethelfled as a sister. I can imagine, thought Osrith, who is only not Etheling because she is a woman. What a burden. Milk, then? Osrith asked, and this time Osferth nodded. I'll keep a table for us here. Lady, Osferth gestured to a small, rude wooden block that could only really be described as a table because there were 2 stools beside it. So, he was pleased about not being royalty for the responsibility it demanded, Osrith thought, as she brought out the goat's milk. But what of other things? He dressed as a priest, but did he yearn for the comforts of monarchy, like his cousin? As Osferth sipped his drink, Osrith asked him why he had taken up the offer by Uhtred to be one of his warriors. I had an uncle who fought, Osferth replied, and then put down his cup. I have seen you fight. Can you tell me, lady, who taught you? How can you do it so well? Not lady, please, she asked, of him. Warrior, if you must. Or commander. I am a commander of the Mercen troops. Osferth looked at her in wonder. How is it you can fight, commander? I mean, he looked away for a moment. You are not a man? No, I am not. Osrith shook her head, and then drew herself closer to Osferth. Can I tell you something it cannot be repeated? He nodded, not taking his wide, pale grey eyes from her face. I was on the battlefield, aged 12, she confided. When I saw parents dead at the hands of the Norse, I felt in my heart I could. And I did. Osrith's mind took her back to that day. Men like giants around her. A terrified boy hiding in the boat she had taken across from Kuldi's monastery with the family she had been fostered to by accident, the father of which trying to rob her at every opportunity. Fed a sword in his hand, which she took, then lost to 9 fingers. I don't have that, Osferth said, sadly. Why not? Do you not hate the Danes as much as anyone? She looked back to him. I saw you cross to Uhtred, to accept a place. But you knew you didn't have it in you? Tradition, admitted Osferth, as if it were the worst thing in the world to admit. So is monastery, Osrith replied. But Osferth hung his head even lower. When I hear of battle, I can feel it, calling to me. But I don't know how to fight. I try to, Osferth continued, for the sake of my grandfather, King Wulfhere, and my uncle. Your uncle? His name was Leofric. And at once, the shy young man brightened at memories in his mind. I have heard his name, once spoken by a lady I was guarding. Osferth smiled, and sipped his goat's milk. Was that lady called Mildrith by any chance? It was, Osrith admitted. And your uncle was brave. Osferth smiled again, his eyes lighting up. He was, indeed he was, commander, and bent his head to Osrith. He would have loved you. He always said he wanted a woman who was a warrior and beautiful. Osrith laughed at that. Then you can do it, Osrith concluded, as she watched her brother get to his feet. Find that again, Osferth. Begin by observing, watching how others behave. Think why they are doing it. Everything has a purpose. Including the dressing down Edward received from his father that night, for promising Uhtred men. Osrith had meant to listen, and had done so by finding the space between the antechamber to the hall of the palace at Aylesbury, and dropped down between 2 inner walls built presumably, for airflow, to move the smoke produced in the central hall fire away from it. She had seen him enter, Bilka just behind them, and saw the priest fold his arms as Edward stood up to Alfred. Osrith couldn't have been prouder of him for speaking to his father and, most importantly, speaking of his limitations. That was leadership, observing one's limitations as well as strengths, before orientating troops to stand for battle. The next thing, Osrith knew, was to actually march out. Where to? Osrith listened carefully, and the name of this fortress came to her ears. They had been there before. The battle was to be Beamflout. 88,888,888. The army mobilized that afternoon. Supplies were found, men saddled and the long marching column established. At the front, the King of Wessex, the Atheling, Steeper and the assembled Mercia lords. More Wessex soldiers were joining them on the way, and Osrith nodded with approval as she collected her armor and helmet of Mercia. He was meeting them before they got to Wessex or Mercia. Her brother was already going to be there to reduce their number. Edward's first command as acting king, while his father lived, just. It was a great move. Even greater was his speech. Edward put aside country and royalty, faction and hierarchy. Instead, he spoke to all men of their land, that had been worked by their fathers and their fathers' fathers, back into time. There was a love to the land. They were the land, Edward told every man before him, and they stood for those who could not fight in this war who loved their land as much as they did. And, as Osrith began to walk at the back of the column with the foot soldiers, a hand landed on her shoulder. "Not you, Osrith." She turned, and it was Miral. He tried to smile at her, but he could not, and Osrith wondered why. She protested anyway. "Aldhelm has given me a position, and I will not fall to failing." And she carried on marching as Miral rode beside her. "Osrith." His voice betrayed both pride and exasperation. "You commanded no one here," he tried. "I command everyone here," Osrith replied, with unassailable logic. "That is what auxiliary captain means, does it not?" "But. So I command myself to fight for the land that I find I love," she concluded. "And you may die for it, is that what you want?" "Is that what they want?" she asked. "A person does not live forever. I cannot be left behind, Miral." He slowed his horse a little, until he was trotting his horse just next to her, then slipped from the saddle. "Take my horse," he insisted, and Osrith found herself scrambling into the saddle of Morning Star, named so for his white patch on his forehead. She turned and watched Miral go back to the stable and bring out another horse, and they rode side by side next to the Mercian army, beyond Watling Street and into the land of the East Angles. 88,888,888. Osrith watched as snow littered the battlefield outside the fortress of Beamflout. The sun was hidden through thick winter clouds and the light was failing. As was her nerve. For she now found herself atop a saddle, waiting to withdraw her sword at the king's command. Which was not coming. The Mercian and West Saxons lined the grove of trees, which overlooked Beamflout, and she could see that, indeed, not all of the men from Dunham were on the battlefield. Across from them few men. Utad's men. She did not look for Finan. That was a future that never was. There was only one path open to her now, and she regretted most dearly not attempting to leave from Bernish's borders with the Gaelish party of nobles and warriors. With Constantine and Domnall Unsained by her side. "Because he is not tagged," Osrith told herself, as she gripped her Sikhs, watching the battle begin. Finan is not tagged. That future had closed. His oath was worth more than pursuing a life with her. And she vaguely wondered whether Ragnar the Fearless had actually given Finan back his coin. Osrith blinked her eyes, trying to concentrate. The numbers were not on his side, but then, she realized, as Miral pointed back along the line and tidied up the stragglers, that were the numbers. Edward had done what he had promised. He had been a king. Yet, looking up the line, she could see Alfred, poker straight, Steeper on his right, hold firm as Edward became edgy. Why could they not engage? Osrith wondered the two, and her eye moved to the field. She was running. In her mind, she would join her brother, stand beside Finan. But she would never get to them. For the Danes had formed a tight circle around Utad's faction and were pressing them tight. Then at last, when Osrith thought she could take the tension no longer, Edward's voice called out to fight. The thunder of hooves was terrific as all men shouted and roared their advance. 2 hours before, and the column was taking up position in the trees. Food was eaten and rest was being had. Steeper had seen her and had strode over to her, his half-grin of bemusement on his features. "I had no instruction from Miral," Osrith began, putting her protest in before he had opened his mouth. "I am not just for skirmishes or guarding Ethelings." Steeper had laughed. "Perhaps you didn't stay long enough in Wessex to find out what you are good for," Steeper said, patting Morning Star's flank. "I am content in Mercia," Osrith replied. You have never seen me on a battlefield. I have, here, on this battlefield. Steeper nodded towards Beamflout. And then, he pulled Osrith towards him, quite unexpectedly. The hug lasted no more than a second or two, and neither of them had anything to say after that. Now, charging towards the Danes, breaking the circle. It seemed to be one of those things that was important at the time, some kind of acceptance. Acceptance that she had chosen to fight with the Saxons, and not with the Danes, some of whom she must have sat and dined with at Dunham. The first Dane she killed flopped before Morning Star, whose hooves beat over the man's body. He whinnied as Osrith drew her sword arm around and sliced with menace at the Dane who was approaching on her left. Ahead of her, Osferth was fighting a brilliant battle, and had managed to stand Dane after Dane who got in his way, wielding his axe to great effect. There was little time to evaluate others' successes, however, and when Osrith swung towards another man, this caused her to slide from the ill-suited saddle and flop into the ground. She turned quickly, missing a hammer blow that would surely have ended her, and struggled to her knees, where tagged Sikhs caused a good deal of successful work to be done on the calves of two men who had hurried to her for an easy kill. Beside her, two West Saxons had managed to down three Danes, and were finishing them off with short stabs to the chest. One of them had his leg entangled around the leg of one of the men and he had been brought down, but quickly moved out of the way as another Dane swung back with his axe and then brought it down onto where the West Saxon would have been if he had not rolled out of the way, and the Dane instead landed his weapon into the stomach of his comrade. Beside her, a great cluster of allies were forming, like an informal shield wall as the Danes fought on two fronts, with no organization. Osrith called for the lines to be met, and an onslaught coming from the center struck the line. They had formed just in time, and the Danes met shield and might behind shield, blunting their attack. Sikhs poked between the interfaces between the shields, forming a lethal wall of spikes onto which the Danes could not help but fall. Back! Osrith called, and the onslaught happened again as another band of Danes attempted the same trick, inculcating the Saxons in their impromptu defensive stance by repeating and repeating the same instructions, to startlingly effectiveness. Beside her, though, more disorganized skirmishes were happening, and she spied Miral having difficulty with a huge, broad, yellow-haired Dane, who was beating her commander back and further back. There was little she could do herself, Osrith knew, but at least her blows could slow him down, so she ran to him, slipping a little in the bloody mud, which was beginning to become endemic throughout the ground layer, and she caught the Dane mid-shin with tagged Sikhs. It stopped his drive, at least, but this presented Osrith with a second problem. The Dane was now interested in fighting her, Osrith having injured him. And he struck hard into her stomach, his knife driving into her ribs as she slipped over. 88,888,888. Beamflout was recovered. That was the first, and the only piece of news Osrith was interested in. Where she was, Osrith could only guess, and recognized the room as only that, with walls and a window. A thick, linen sheet was covering her. She had tried to move several times, but pain in her chest prevented her, and she lay quite still for some time, wondering where she was. Somewhere safe, obviously, Osrith's mind deduced, and somewhere she was wanted. Miral visited her that afternoon, and Aldhelm shortly afterwards. Beamflout was recovered, they told her, and it took a week of making sure she could move, and could stand, to ensure that Osrith was convinced in herself that, though she was injured, she was recovering. She would need her strength. And it was from that window, 2 weeks after Beamflout, that she watched Utad, along with Finan, Citric, Osferth and Skade leave. They are going Saltwick, Miral told her, when he came to see her that afternoon. So it was decided then, and Osrith told herself she had to harden her heart to Finan the Agile, to make it easier for herself. And she must make a plan, a long plan, one which would include several months of planning to execute to greatest effect. She was going to Alba, that unconquerable place, and offer herself back to King Domhnall, for service. You had a chest injury, I took the liberty to treat you myself, under the circumstances, Aldhelm explained to her that evening. And am I going to recover? Her question seemed to amuse him, and she smiled as Aldhelm smiled. Osrith, you received a 6-inch blade in between your ribs, but by some miracle you lived when you should have died. Osrith felt towards her side. I know where you went, he added. Dunham? It is where Bika and Thyra went. He spoke of you to me. Does Lord Ethliad? He does not. And Osrith leaned forward, kissing Aldhelm's cheek. Thank you for being a friend, she added, and he nodded in acknowledgement, taking her hand. Then, his face took on a grave expression. He dropped Osrith's hand, turned as if to go, and then turned back. If you had to choose, Osrith, between Ethelfled and Ethliad, for the good of Mercia? Osrith stared back at him. There was no question in her mind, at all. I would choose Alfred's daughter, Lord Aldhelm. Aldhelm held her gaze for a second, then closed his eyes as he nodded briefly at Osrith. He made it to the door before he turned and looked at her again, and smiled, half-heartedly. Osrith waited for the news, wondering how bad it was going to be. You have new orders, auxiliary captain, he added. You are to leave for Wessex, under Ethliad's orders. You retain your position but are to serve him there for the time that we are next in Winchester. Bad then, Osrith thought, and looked back out of the window again, at the gates of Aylesbury. 88,888,888. Dawn light flooded the eastern sky as the army of the Danes found the Riverers, 2 weeks before the great Heathen army split in half. They were marching at the border of East Anglia. Ahead, a small rise of hills separated the lands once ruled by King Ethelstan, Guthrum as was, and that of Mercia. Tell me again, Ethelwold asked of Canute, for want of something to say, what is meant if someone is a Kriegjevind? Canute turned his head and examined Ethelwold's face. Do you not have women warriors in Wessex? Not generally, no, Ethelwold replied. Yet, she is the exception. Ahead, more men were decamping and getting their horses. The attack would come swiftly and it would come strongly that day. With luck, the Mersons would still be rubbing sleep from their eyes. They are common in Denmark, though few travel to England, Canute explained. Women who choose to fight are called Kriegjevind. Oh, so, women warriors? Canute nodded. Quite so. But there is an honor about them. No Dane is to take them, no harm must come to them, no man is to challenge them. And yet. Yet? Ethelwold prompted. This Kriegjevind I have heard of. And if she is who I think she is ... she is the same woman. I have seen her before. Ethelwold stared at Canute. Can you speak plainer? Canute drew his horse to a stop, and turned to stare at the Ethelwold. That woman, who was not a Dane, Canute said, was made Kriegjevind by Erik Thorgilson, a distinction all of us must honor. However, this Gaelish woman, he broke off and wiped his hand through his beard, she was in Aryan. So I have heard, Ethelwold replied. So, she must be a witch. Ethelwold contemplated that information, which fitted very neatly with the intelligence he had gained from a guard he had bribed about her nightly visits to the heathen Britons. She made the sun die, Canute added, and Ethelwold was certain he saw the man shiver. The sun is very much alive, Ethelwold replied, nodding east, as if to prove a point. Look. But Ethelwold was not counting on the big, red-haired Dane leaning from his saddle and pulling Ethelwold by the neck of his clothes. Do you not know? He whispered with a fearsome hiss. Sometimes, the sun can disappear, a witch can make that permanent. And she was that witch? Ethelwold suggested, choking a little under Canute's grasp. I heard say that she was then drowned, Canute mused, loosening his grasp on Ethelwold, as he looked towards Mercia. Then what was she doing here, if drowned? Ethelwold asked, disbelievingly. And transformed into a gilt, water sorceress, Heston reasoned, thoughtfully. Why must you make everything worse? Behind them, Ragnar, on the last morning of his life hurried his horse to be the other side of Ethelwold, and he drew a short blade towards him. That woman has every right to her choice, her duty, her reputation. He narrowed his eyes. Has she spurned you? When Ethelwold did not reply, Ragnar leaned back into his saddle. "Then she is 1,000 times your worth, Ethelwold," he said, "so remember, you are here for one purpose and one purpose only, for your intelligence in Wessex." Then Ragnar stood up in his stirrups, sword unsheathed, and he thrust it hard into the air, so all of the army could see. We go on.